was a horrific time for our nation.
It's American history, it's Oklahoma history, it's the history of the city.
Governor Murphy from the great state of New Jersey, Governor Ned Lamont from the great state of Connecticut, and we have a joint announcement that we're going to make.
Good evening. Thanks for being with us tonight. It's the 104th day of the national emergency. It's the 32nd day since the country has been involved in civil unrest. And it's the 4th day of New York's Phase 2 and the first day that New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut have instituted a travel quarantine from people from other states. Very interesting days. Speaking of interesting days, June 21st was the summer solstice. That's us passing through something, and I think every day so far in recent months, certainly for the last 102 days, every day feels like we're passing through something. And, in our personal lives, sometimes when things aren't going so well, we talk about hitting bottom. Hitting bottom gives us an opportunity to bounce back and start heading for the top again. And I think many of us are wondering if our country has hit bottom yet. We feel like we're now moving toward a more enlightened future. But I think some of us know that really can't happen until we've hit bottom. And so tonight we're going to talk about a topic where, you wonder if this country has hit bottom in its past. The 1921 race massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a horrific event that was made even more horrific, if that can be possible, by the fact that it was attempted to erase the event from our history books. So a lot of times I feel like we as Americans feel confidence in this concept, in this idea of it can't happen here. Something so bad can't happen here, not in this great nation. But I think it's important that we look back at our history and see what things have happened here. So we're going to look at this event from a couple of different angles. And the first angle where we're going to talk about tonight is education. And even that has two parts, because there's the education of ourselves about the event, but then there's the education of our community, of our children. How are we going to teach this event? And how are we going to make sure that things like this never get buried under the carpet, never get erased? All right. First, I want to go back to the local. Here we are. We're in phase 2. Mask maintain and multiple hand washings. That's how we're going to get through. New York City has been really diligent. Remember, none of this depends on 100%, perfection from 100% of the people. If we get most people on board doing most of this most of the time, we are able to get ahead of the virus, even though we're starting from behind. So we've flattened the curve here in the city. Everyone is remaining diligent. And now the governors of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut have gotten together and created a travel quarantine.
Governor Murphy from the great state of New Jersey, Governor Ned Lamont from the great state of Connecticut, and we have a joint announcement that we're going to make. So we're announcing today a joint travel advisory. People coming in from states that have a high infection rate must quarantine for 14 days. And we have a calibration for the infection rate, and any state that goes over that infection rate, that state will be subject to the quarantine.
Okay, and we put the link to that video in the credits, and we'll post the link in the discussion bar because it's important to watch the rest of the video. He goes on to describe how the percentages of the individual states will vary, which states are on that list. And he goes into a little bit about how this is going to take effect, but it's certainly the first time in my lifetime I've ever heard of some kind of barrier like that in between interstate travel. And I know they were talking about it in the very beginning. They were talking about quarantining people from New York going to different places. So now it's interesting that the folks, the governors in the tri-state area have come along and created this quarantine. So I think it's important for us to educate ourselves, to know how this is going to go on and how this affects us. Okay, we are going to jump right in now. We are very lucky tonight to have two great people on the show. We're going to watch the second half of the Tulsa Race Massacre, Then and Now, video that was produced by the Tulsa Public Schools. And then we're going to have Jamie Lomax. She's the Director of Organizational Learning and Equity on, and she's going to be on with Amanda Solivan, and she is the Social Studies Content Manager. And the two of them are a great discussion group because Jamie kind of gives us the background from the starting point of many people in Tulsa in this day and age didn't even know that this incident had occurred or to what magnitude this incident had occurred, because the people who were involved in it were so good at erasing the story from our history. And Amanda is great at filling in the details of what's going on in the schools right now. How is this being taught? And then she also has some very interesting things to say about how curricula get decided upon in our public schools. And then while we were prepping for this, the statement came up, all history is political. And those are true, but in a way, I think, very scary words. Okay, let's watch the second part of the video. The first part of the video dealt with the actual facts, like what happened in this event. And now we get to discussing what we're going to talk a little bit more about tonight. And what we're going to experience is the education of ourselves and the education of our children about the 1921 race massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
It was a horrific time for our nation.
It's American history, it's Oklahoma history, it's the history of the city.
For a lot of kids, when they think of topics like segregation, they think of the deep, deep South, and they don't really connect it to Oklahoma and Tulsa.
Shrita Ashley teaches history at Edison Preparatory School. She says educating students about the race massacre helps them self-reflect and grow as young adults.
It made it more real for them because they could connect to places they knew in town, parts of town that they had lived in the past or they live in currently, and understand why was there so much difference between different segments of Tulsa.
But having these conversations has proved difficult for many adults, even teachers.
They did not feel comfortable talking about this part of history in their classrooms. They didn't know how to discuss it and address it.
Brown saying many educators she's mentored lacked enough knowledge to facilitate meaningful conversations.
They did not know enough about it to be able to educate their students about it.
For Shrita Ashley, the educational process for teachers begins with self-awareness.
And be okay with accepting that you've done things wrong, and it's okay. You know, you're a person, you're a human, and you realize this hasn't been working, and it's okay to change that.
Saying it's important to be okay with being uncomfortable, knowing students have a safe place to learn, discuss, and express themselves about the terrible events during the Tulsa Race Massacre.
So I think by having kids exposed to teachers who can guide them and facilitate those types of discussions helps the kids see how to facilitate those discussions.
They need to be aware of and be able to understand sort of how this issue still impacts them, how it still impacts their community.
That they give students the freedom to respond as openly and honestly as they would like. Give them the opportunity to express themselves.
The hope is that by educating students about the Tulsa Race Massacre and the lasting effects still resonating in Tulsa today,
the biggest strides and the biggest changes are definitely going to come in having kids grow up and take in those positions of power. They become the teachers, they become the leaders.
that they can grow into more well-informed adults that can create positive, lasting change in Tulsa.
Most of these students, as history has shown us, will be here. They'll be leaders in our city, and they can see where these problems started, and they can figure out where to go from here.
Hoping one day the deadly racist attack will serve as a reminder of our evil past, but also highlight the qualities of African Americans who endured such terrible acts of violence and oppression.
It was an attempted expulsion that was unsuccessful, and I think probably the thing that Black people are most proud about in relationship to the Tulsa Race Riot or the massacre is the fact that the community was rebuilt.
That African Americans in Tulsa would not break to the pressure of racism and injustice.
It's a testament to the strength of the community. It's a testament to the high quality of the people who were adversely impacted by the race riot.
And the importance of learning about our history so the city can heal, ultimately making Tulsa a place everyone feels welcome, that everyone can be proud to call home.
It makes the society better. That's why we believe in public education, right? Because an educated public leads us to all have a better quality of life.
And so I think it's more than just the history of violence and destruction. It's also this really story about courage and persistence and resilience.
Very powerful. The story itself is very powerful, and then, you know, I think it's too small to even call it a cover-up. You know, it's like it's an eradication of people, you know, and it's a part of our history that, as we were having, I'm sure this word will come up in our conversation, you know, that it's time, way past time for us to acknowledge. That's the word, acknowledge. So it's a great honor to welcome Jamie Lomax and Amanda Solivan to Dispatches tonight. We're very lucky. Jamie is the Director of Organizational Learning and Equity. Now, that's quite a title, and even just that one word, equity, I think is something very resonant right now and definitely worth exploring. And Amanda is the social studies content manager from Tulsa Public Schools. And as I was saying, Amanda does a great job of putting this event and how we're now teaching it to not only ourselves but to children. Puts that into a great context. So, okay, so here we go. I got to practice pushing the button. Okay, there's Amanda, and then boom, there is Jamie. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Okay, so Jamie, as we began in our prep conversation this afternoon, Tulsa had quite a weekend. So give us a little bit of a picture. How does it feel there now?
Well, it was quite an intense time. It felt a little bit like the city was holding its breath last week, just in anticipation and in the uncertainty of not knowing how many thousands of people would descend on Tulsa, not knowing the tenor of the mood when they may have left the event. So there was some trepidation, to be sure, last week. I think there was a collective sigh of relief Saturday night, Sunday, definitely, through the shift that was able to take place as a result of the celebrations, beautiful celebrations of Juneteenth on both Friday and Saturday, and the peaceful demonstrations. And so I think we have returned to some semblance of normal, as normal can be right now, with the exception of major spikes in cases in the state and in the city. But there was a great deal of tension last week, and I think we're all, particularly those of us who are in it, who are really involved, experiencing a little fatigue.
And so, to start back at square one, you both have very interesting titles. So, Jamie, you're the Director of Organizational Learning and Equity. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. So equity positions are pretty common in large urban school districts around the country, particularly they started really on the coasts. Oakland and Portland are two that pop to mind as having equity work for a long time. But what we know to be true is that identity is a major contributing factor in student outcomes, and with race and class being the highest influence over student outcomes. And positions like mine around the country are designed to really uproot and find the ways in which we can disrupt those patterns of outcomes through a variety of ways, right? Through strategic ways, through funding, through professional learning, through healing. So we spend a lot of time thinking about what do our kids need and what do our adults need in order to be able to provide that for kids.
And so is that physical, as in boundaries and who goes to what school?
It can be. It's also about where do we put our time, people, and money, right? Where do we make the greatest investments based on those who have historically been the least reached?
Okay, and Amanda, what does a social studies content manager do?
I look at curriculum K-12 for social studies, and that's deciding what we should be teaching in school, how we should be teaching it, how we provide teachers with those resources, and how we train people. And that's also a great deal of mindset. We don't want our classrooms to look like they did in 1980. We need them to be contemporary, and we really want to work with people like Jamie to make sure that our teachers know what our students need and how to provide that for them. So that's the overall job of a content manager in Tulsa Public Schools.
Got it. Okay. So then, Jamie, this first, tell us about the difficulties that were encountered in just learning about the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, and then what was some of the journey to bring it into the public school curriculum?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's been a long time coming. So, unfortunately, any discussion of the massacre was really squashed for decades. it wasn't until the 90s, 1997 specifically, that a commission was formed to investigate and provide a report. But even that was not particularly widely distributed. It wasn't really talked about. It wasn't something that caught a lot of news at the time, 1997. I was a brand new Tulsan at that time, having come to Tulsa for university. And it was not something that I had ever been taught in my Oklahoma history classes, in U.S. history. It wasn't something I encountered even as a student at the University of Tulsa. So when I was teaching, I was actually coaching in one of our high schools, Central High School, which its original location is less than a mile from the Greenwood district. Wow. It was not being taught then. This was in 2008, 2010. It's not something that had come to the level of consciousness that it had appeared in curriculum. Even though our students were descendants of those affected by the massacre, those who had been killed or who had been held in detention in one of the theaters at that time. And there was kind of a low level, it was there, but it was never addressed in curriculum. So one of the history teachers came to me and we decided that it was imperative that we do so. But even in that time, it was hard to find materials. We had a hard time finding resources. So we ended up going back to the University of Tulsa, who has a special collection in the library, and sitting with the special collections librarian and listening to the tale of the race massacre, which at that time was still called a riot, even in 2010, was mind-blowing. It was not something either of us knew in depth about, and we were stunned. And so collectively, we designed a unit. She delivered it to our 9th grade Oklahoma history students. And we are really lucky now to have it be part of the Oklahoma state standards. But it has been quite a journey to get here.
Wow. So even it took about 10 years to go from uncovering to having it be part of the state curriculum?
Yeah, I think I would have to defer to other people who have more expertise around how we ended up in that place. But as the centennial has approached, there has been an investment of time and attention across the state, the formation of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Commission, which is dedicated to ensuring that this event is taught and understood and never repeated, has really provided a lot of impetus for the shift into statewide curriculum.
And then can you just say one or two words, and I don't mean to be redundant, but I do think it's important for us to be literally talking about this, is why was it so difficult to find information? Why wasn't it being talked about since 1921?
Well, it's an extremely shameful part of our past. And there are rumors even of archives of newspapers of the time having been cut up, and there's no record even of some of the articles that were being printed at the time of the massacre. It was an attempted genocide. Nobody really likes to talk about genocide.
So that being the case then, Amanda, then how do we bring this to the kids? How do we disseminate this to the public? How is this talked about now?
Well, I think that there are a lot of things that teachers are starting to really consider when they're looking at the Tulsa Race Massacre. So a lot of the teachers who instruct in it, we just had a Tulsa Race Massacre Institute where we had some teachers that came and talked about their experiences with instruction. I think the first thing that we really have to recognize is that this is a highly sensitive subject that requires what we would call building community. So before anybody really embarks in this, or any type of hard history, one that happened in your backyard and is still a part of the community and the community is still struggling with healing from, is that we have to have a safe place for kids. This is not something that teachers want to start off with on day one. It's something that they need to work at building and making students feel comfortable in their class before embarking on this. And so there's a lot of different ways of approaching that. The history that we teach now, we teach not by standing and telling kids what happened in history, but teaching kids how to be an explorer, a detective, and look through history. And teachers, particularly white teachers, it behooves them to provide what we would call a primary source for students. And primary sources are things that took place in the time period. Firsthand accounts of what happened, newspaper articles, film footage, things that they can look at and have a good question for students to answer. One question that are part of our state standards now is should this be called a race riot or should this be called a race massacre? And part of that is really needing to dive in and looking at the meaning of a word. How does calling this a race riot imply that there is fault on the part of African Americans versus race massacre, which is ownership of whites in a violent, using violence for subjugation? And so students really need to explore the use of that language and explore why we cover up history or why we call things one thing instead of another. And that's it can take a long time. This isn't something that a teacher should cover in a day and then close the door and say, hey, we're done. I think the other thing is really, Jamie had wisely said that some of these students have families that have been in Tulsa and experienced the Tulsa race massacre. So there's a lot of trauma that is involved in this too. I think right now our country is feeling exhausted, and we have to engage in these conversations, but we also really have to recognize that our students can be experiencing trauma, and this is very heavy and difficult for them to be engaging with. And so we also need to make a safe space for students to go where they don't necessarily always have to be in class for every part of this conversation. So lastly, I would also say that teachers need to be very reflective, that they themselves don't have all of the answers, that this is a space where they too can be vulnerable and they can be learning from the experience of their students and their students' families. And they just need to be very open in terms of having conversation.
Wow, thank you. And Jamie, then, because Amanda just mentioned, this current moment. And so this current moment is pandemic, it's the president, it's protests. How has this affected, the community and this story?
I think I might be frozen.
Yes, I think you're frozen. And yes, and us trying to communicate on Skype and Zoom and things where sometimes people freeze. There you go. I think.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're back. Okay, you're back with us. Can you hear us? There we go. Can you hear us? Nope. I think you froze again. All right, let's just give it a second. How was that? Oops. Here, let me see if I can. And then there. No? Okay. Well, we have officially lost Amanda. We'll see if she bleeps back on. We've lost Jamie. Amanda's still here. Sorry.
I'm still here.
Yeah, sorry. So, this you mentioned this particular moment. This particular moment is, I think, traumatic. I think no matter where you fall on the spectrum of beliefs in our society, I think these moments are traumatic for everybody right now. How do you feel like things are playing out and affecting this, the story of this massacre now?
Well, I think that there is a large collective conscious in Tulsa and throughout the state of Oklahoma and throughout the country that's saying this is not a narrative that we need to overlook. We really need to unsurface this, just like we're looking at a lot of the stories of our past, and we're really starting to look at ourselves now. And sometimes looking at the mirrors of our past are the way that we tell our history, the stories, the names that we choose really tells a lot about who we are in the present. And so by acknowledging and working towards collectively all sharing that this is part of our history, as unsavory, as unpleasant as it is, we need to unearth it. There's also a lot of moves within Tulsa. There's a commission that is trying to look and see if there are any mass graves that are there. And although that work has been put to the side a little bit with the pandemic, there is, activity and motion in this. And this is part of acknowledging the past and making sure that the people who were murdered and their bodies thrown away are found. Great.
Yes.
We're happy to have you back.
Yes.
Happy to be back. Sorry about that.
Yeah, that's okay. We were talking about, literally this moment, and Amanda was mentioning that I guess it's part of this commission that they're investigating potentially unearthing some potential mass graves.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so that was something that they were about to do just before the pandemic hit.
That's right. They had done some investigation, done some sonar, radar, new technology. There had been previous investigations one previous investigation that turned up some perhaps questionable things, but as technology has evolved dramatically since then, there's a much clearer indication that there are places really worth investigating, worth kind of excavating with care and respect, obviously, to determine, particularly if there is an opportunity for DNA testing to identify survivors, to identify descendants and families. In the long run, I would hope that there would be meaningful reparations made to the families of descendants.
Oh, wow. All right, a horrific story made even more horrific because of the attempt to literally scrub it from our history. So what are some next steps? What are some good ideas? What do we do? Where do we donate? What do we disseminate?
Yeah, I think educating ourselves, not just about the race massacre itself, although that's a critical moment in history. And I have high recommendations for Hannibal Johnson's work, HannibalBJohnson.com, if you're looking for a website. And he has written several books about the massacre, including a children's book. Randy Crable, whose last name I will spell Kriehbul, Randy Crable, also wrote a book, both significant, important investigations. But I also think there is an important piece of it that is, this was one incident, and if we try to treat it as one incident, then we lose the larger picture of the way oppression has adapted in our country, the way racism has adapted in our country. And so I think just really understanding that this one horrific incident is of the way African Americans have experienced America, and to be able to connect the Tulsa Race Massacre to what has sparked kind of uprisings and protests in our country today, Mr. Floyd's murder. So all of it is connected, and there is a direct line from the race massacre to Mr. Floyd. I think really for us to acknowledge, understand, and if that doesn't yet feel true, to keep learning, to keep exploring, keep digging into the things that haven't been told. All history is political, and the history books have been written with an intent in mind. Southern history books particularly, right? Southern history books have been deeply influenced by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And so when we think about the stories that we've been taught, there is a reason we haven't been taught this. It serves someone. Who does it serve? So I think becoming critical historians, which Amanda can speak to much more eloquently than I, but it behooves us all, I guess, to become critical consumers of history, particularly to identify the voices that have been silenced and the stories that haven't been told.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you. That's amazing. And so, Amanda, it was also mentioned this idea of being a detective of history. Is that what Jamie was talking about a little bit? Is there a little bit more, responsibility that we have to take than simply turning on the news every night?
Well, I think we need to look at, I think part of the problem that we have is hearing just one voice and not several, whether it's always turning on the same broadcast and not listening to a myriad to know all of the different voices that are out there and what people are saying. I think it's also, we don't necessarily need to all be digging through primary sources, but I think we do need to take a critical look at our history and how we're telling it. What resources are we really using? Some historians, like Howard Zinn, for example, wrote a book called A People's History, and it has been really foundational in terms of saying our history isn't just about white men. It is a history of a diverse people, and we really need to look at everyone's history because it is our story. And we're still on a quest, we're on a journey. And I think that where we are right now in the United States is that our journey really has to be about all of us achieving equality. That at the Revolutionary War, we didn't all gain freedom. People were still enslaved during that time. And so we need to look at all of our stories, including the stories of our founding fathers. Many of those men owned slaves, and we really need to take a rich look at our history and see how we have gotten to where we are today and what we can do in order to change some of those things. It's not about whitewashing or erasing our history, but it's about motivating us to see what we need to do in a moment. And really looking at our schools. What are our history books? What are history books saying? How are we representing ideas? Are all of our students with their diverse backgrounds represented? Do they feel comfortable? These are some of the questions that we really need to be asking.
Wow, fantastic. Yeah, it's epic. It's so large, and I guess taking the responsibility for taking another look, because we all were taught what we think then is history. But now when you ask us to investigate who wrote those history books and potentially what agendas did they have, so this story will continue. And so thank you both very much. Really, we are honored to have you come and spend some of your time. I know you both are being asked, to talk about this story by many, many people. But hopefully we'll be able to come back. So I'm going to research and look into the folks who made that video. I'm very interested that a public school system came up and made that video that we watched. I'm very impressed with that. And then also talk to some of these historians about the actual story, about what happened. And then maybe we can check in with the two of you again at some point and just hear what's going on in the institutes, what's going on in education, and how are we actually moving forward with all of this.
Awesome. That sounds great. Thank you for having us.
Thank
We
you.
appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. Be safe, and we'll speak soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Wow. When I was thinking about this show and these things that we were going to speak about, I really could only think of one thing right now to kind of follow that immediately, and that's Franklin Rankin's "Lift Every Voice and Sing" and Ed Hughes photographs from the protests that have been going on here in New York.
I want you to know that you matter. I want you to know that your lives matter, that your dreams matter. And there is a change in mindset that's taking place. We certainly are not alone, and we are in this together, and we're in it with some great people like Jamie Lomax and Amanda Solivan, who were so wonderful. And we're also in it with folks like Gus Constantellis, who you remember from many, many times on this show. And now Gus put up a video, gonna help us all, remembering us, reminding us. I got two of them right here. Come on, folks, grab your masks. Let's put on those masks. All right. Gus does it much better than me. God love Gus. Okay, here we go. Gus.
Leaving the house, grocery shopping, taking the trash out. Just miss the smell of Target. Wear a mask. Wear a mask. Wear a mask. Wear a mask. Walking your dog. Going to a protest. Divorcing your husband. Don't want to die. Wear a mask. Wear a mask. Wear a mask. Wear a mask. Do you think I got my point across? Or yeah, okay, but this time with the wig. Wear a mask. Wear a mask. Wear a mask. Wear a mask. Wear a mask.
That's what I'm talking about. Gus, tell him, and tell him again, and tell him with a wig on. Wear a mask. All right, ladies and gentlemen. Mask maintain, and multiple hand washings, right? Okay, the weekend's coming up. Have a couple of uncomfortable conversations. Think about some of these things. And once you start to get into that zone of uncomfort, then I think that's when we can sort of begin to feel like we're heading in the right direction. All right, folks, I'm still hanging with the old ways. Hunker, hug, and haven. Have a very safe weekend and wear a mask.